There is a man in England who has never once asked to be feared, and yet every room he enters goes quiet before he reaches the door. They call him the Blind Duke. They say his eyes see nothing. They are wrong about one thing, and they will never know it until it is far too late. Tonight, a girl of 19 is being handed to him like a ledger entry, like a line item in her father's ruin. She does not know what waits for her at Blackthorne Manor. Neither does her father. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The night her father sold her, it rained. Not the dramatic kind of rain that novels promise for moments like these, not thunder cracking the sky open or lightning splitting the elm tree in the yard. Just steady, indifferent English rain, the kind that soaks through wool and settles in the bones and cares nothing for the fact that inside the study of a mortgaged townhouse on Aldermere Street, a man was signing away his only daughter's life to keep himself out of debtor's prison. Vivian Hale stood in the corridor outside that study for 47 minutes. She knew the number because the grandfather clock at the far end of the hall was the only thing in the house that still worked without apology, still told the truth without flinching, and she'd watched its hands move with the fixed attention of someone who has run out of useful things to do with her body while her mind refuses to stop working. She could hear them through the door. Her father's voice, low, wet with desperation, slipping and catching on words the way a drunk man's foot catches on a stair he's descended 1,000 times. And the other voice, the solicitor, a man named Graves, which seemed, under the circumstances, like God's idea of a joke if God had been paying any attention at all. The contract is binding upon signature, Graves said. The Duke has been patient, Mr. Hale. That patience has a conclusion. Yes, I understand that. I only thought if there were another arrangement, there is not. A silence. Then the scratch of a pen. Vivian's hand was flat against the wall. The plaster was cold. She pressed harder, feeling the texture of it, the small imperfections. A hairline crack running from the wainscoting up toward the ceiling, the paint going soft with damp near the window. And she thought very clearly, this is the last time I will touch this wall. And then she thought, why would I want to touch it again? And then she thought nothing at all for a moment, because the door opened. Her father came out first. He was 53 years old and looked 70 in bad light, which Aldermere Street's corridor very much was. He had the eyes of a man who had been apologizing his entire life, and had long since stopped believing the apology changed anything, but couldn't stop making it. His cravat was loose. There was ink on his right hand. "Vivien," he said. She looked at him, that was all. She simply looked, and something in her face made him look at the floor. Graves came behind him, tucking documents into a leather satchel with the careful efficiency of a man who has done this before and will do it again, and does not particularly lose sleep about it either way. He was thin, gray, wore spectacles that had left permanent dents on either side of his nose. "Miss Hale." He didn't look up from the satchel. "The Duke's carriage will collect you at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. You are permitted 2 trunks. Any excess baggage will be returned." He paused. "Arrangements will not be renegotiated. The contract is completed." He left. The front door clicked shut behind him with the small, firm sound of a period at the end of a sentence. Her father tried again. "Vivien? How much?" she said. "What? How much?" Her voice was the same temperature as the plaster. "The number. The amount. What am I worth exactly in your ledger?" He flinched. She watched him do it. Watched his hands come up and then drop, watched the reflex of a man reaching for comfort he doesn't deserve, and stopping himself just short of reaching it. "It isn't like that. Tell me the number, father." 11,000, he said. And then, like it made it better, pounds. Vivien breathed in, breathed out. 11,000 pounds. She had been 19 years old for 3 weeks. She had never been to Paris. She had never been kissed by anyone she chose. She had read every book in the house worth reading, had taught herself basic accounting because her father's bookkeeper had quit 2 years ago, and someone had to know if they were solvent, which they were not, which she had known for 18 months before her father had bothered to notice. 11,000 pounds. "Go to bed," she said. "I have to pack." He stood there a moment longer, doing that thing he did, that reaching thing, that almost touching her shoulder thing, and she turned and walked down the corridor to the stairs, and he did not follow her. She spent the night with her trunks open on the bedroom floor, moving through the arithmetic of what to take when you were leaving a life that was never quite enough to begin with. The practical things went first: 3-day dresses, 2 for evening, undergarments and stockings, her mother's silver brush set because it was hers by right, and she'd be damned if she left it. The copy of Middlemarch she'd read 4 times, the small notebook she used for figures, her one good pair of boots. She did not take the watercolor she'd made at 13 that still hung above the writing desk. She did not take the pressed flowers from her mother's funeral that she'd kept in the bottom drawer under a silk handkerchief. She stood in front of those flowers for a long time, the handkerchief in her hand, and then she set them back and closed the drawer. Some things you carry differently, not in trunks. She sat on the edge of the bed at 4 in the morning and stared at the rain on the window glass and tried to assemble what she knew about Lucian Blackthorne, Duke of Blackthorne, lord of an estate somewhere north of civilization in the kind of moorland that polite society referred to as character-building countryside, which meant cold, remote, and without theater. What she knew was not much and was not reassuring. He was 31, unmarried. Had been unmarried long enough that London had stopped predicting when he'd take a wife and started theorizing why he hadn't. His parents had died when he was 19. Carriage accident was the official account, though she'd overheard once at a dinner her father had dragged her to, 2 women in ostrich feathers saying accident with the particular emphasis that meant they were not convinced. He had withdrawn from society entirely following their deaths, managed his estates through intermediaries, was seen in London perhaps twice in a decade, and then only briefly, and by no one who could afterward describe him with any confidence. And there was the blindness. That part had arrived in stages, first the whispers that he'd been ill following his parents' deaths, then the rumors that it had taken his sight, then the settled assumption, repeated now as fact, that the Duke of Blackthorne was permanently, completely sightless, had been for years, and navigated his estate and his affairs by means of extraordinary memory and a staff trained to serve a man without eyes. Vivien pressed her palms against her knees and thought about that. A blind man in a remote estate who didn't want a wife and had not chosen one, who had instead accepted a contracted arrangement with the indebted father of a girl he'd never met. Why? That was the question she'd turned over for 6 days since her father had first told her, in his breaking, wet-eyed way, that there'd been a development. Why would a man of that wealth and that reputation accept a stranger's daughter as a settlement for another man's debt? What did he want from it? What did he get? She didn't have an answer. She was going to have to live inside the question until one emerged. At 7 in the morning, she washed her face in cold water, dressed in her second-best traveling dress, the gray wool with the dark buttons, pinned her hair without looking at herself too long in the glass, and went downstairs. Her father was already in the entrance hall. He was wearing his good coat, which meant he'd slept in it or hadn't slept at all, and he was holding his hat in both hands the way he always held things when he was sorry and couldn't say it. "I'll write to you," he said. Vivien looked at the clock, 7:43. "Will you?" she said. Not cruel, just exact. "Vivien, if you write, I will read it." She picked up her gloves from the hall table. "I won't promise more than that." The carriage arrived at 8 o'clock precisely. She had expected something modest, a working vehicle, functional, the kind of equipage that said wealth administered carefully from a distance. What was waiting on Aldermere Street was none of those things. It was black, the entire carriage, black lacquered to a depth that seemed to pull light into it rather than reflect it. The horses were matched blacks, 4 of them, standing with a patience that looked less like training and more like absolute conviction. The coachman on the box was a large, still man who looked at nothing in particular and whose stillness had a quality to it. Not emptiness, but concentration. There was no crest on the door, just the black. She walked out into the rain. She did not look back at her father in the doorway, not because she'd decided not to, but because something in her chest made the turning impossible, and she had learned early to work around her own limitations rather than fight them at bad moments. The footman, young, quiet, with the manner of someone who had been instructed to be invisible, handed her up. She settled against the seat. The leather was cold and smelled of beeswax and something faintly mineral, like stone rooms. The interior was plain. No embroidered cushions, no gilt fittings. One lamp, unlit. A lap blanket folded with geometric precision on the seat across from her. The door closed. The carriage moved. Aldermere Street fell away. London folded around them and then began to thin, the buildings giving way to longer distances. The gray sky widening above the roof lines until there were no roof lines, just gray and the movement of the horses and the sound of rain on the carriage roof above her, steady in particular. And Vivien sat with her hands in her lap and let the city go. She'd thought she would feel something specific at this moment. She had spent 6 days anticipating the specific feeling. Terror, she'd expected. Or grief. Or that particular hollow misery that follows the point at which all decisions have been made and the future becomes purely a matter of arriving at it. What she felt instead was something colder and sharper. Attention. She was paying attention the way you do when you have been handed a problem you didn't choose and can't refuse, and the only power left to you is understanding it. Lucian Blackthorne. A blind duke. An estate at the edge of the moors. A marriage contract signed in 47 minutes. She was going to understand every piece of it. She didn't know what that would cost her. She was going to find out. The journey north took the better part of 2 days, with a single night stopped at a posting inn that was clean, quiet, and populated by people who looked at the black carriage without looking at it. The particular art of the English countryside when it encounters something it has been silently warned about. The footman, whose name she learned was Thomas, was sparing with information in a way that felt less like reticence and more like policy. He answered her direct questions with direct answers and nothing adjacent to them. The estate was 4 hours further north. The Duke was in residence. She would be met upon arrival. Yes, the staff had been informed. No, he could not speak to the Duke's temperament. That wasn't his place to characterize. Has he always been blind? She asked at dinner the first night, more to see what Thomas would do with the question than because she expected a useful answer. He set down the breadbasket carefully. I've been in service at Blackthorne for 6 years, Miss Hale. The Duke has not had sight in any of those years. That's a very precise answer to a slightly different question, she said. Thomas looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. Yes, he said, it is. She let it sit. They reached Blackthorne Manor in the late afternoon of the second day, when the light was doing that thing northern light does in autumn, going amber and low and casting everything into a sharpness that normal daylight doesn't permit, every edge of stone and branch outlined with unusual clarity against a sky the color of pewter. She had expected something Gothic, towers, ironwork, the architectural grammar of ruin. What she saw was older and stranger than that. The manor was enormous in the way that serious old houses are enormous. Not showy, not reaching for impression, but simply occupying more space than a building had any business occupying, as though it had been growing slowly in place for 2 centuries and had not yet decided to stop. It was built from the local limestone, which had gone dark with centuries of weather, and it sat on a rise above a long approach road lined with oaks so old their branches had grown together overhead to form a tunnel. Through the tunnel she could see the house, and the house was lit, properly lit, windows glowing amber in the fading afternoon, which was the first thing about it that surprised her. She had half expected dark. She had expected a house that had given up on light. The carriage passed through the oak tunnel and drew up before the front steps. Those steps were wide and low and flanked by stone urns that held nothing, having outlasted whatever had grown in them seasons ago. The door at the top was already open. A woman stood in it, 50 perhaps, with white streaked dark hair pinned back severely, and the bearing of someone who had decided long ago that dignity was a non-negotiable operating condition and had never revisited that decision. She was not warm, she was not unwelcoming, she was simply there, in the door, watching the carriage with an expression that Vivien couldn't read immediately, which itself was information. Miss Hale. The woman came down the steps as Thomas handed Vivien out. I am Mrs. Denton, housekeeper. The Duke asked me to receive you and see you settled before dinner. Thank you, Vivien said. And is the Duke? He will join you at dinner, 7 o'clock. Mrs. Denton's gaze traveled over her. Not rudely, not slowly, but with the comprehensive efficiency of someone cataloging a situation they'll be responsible for managing. You must be tired. I'm not, actually. A pause. Well, Mrs. Denton said, and then, without elaboration, she turned and led Vivien up the steps and through the door. The interior was not what she had expected either. She had been building, over 2 days in the carriage, a mental image of the interior of Blackthorne Manor. Rooms draped in holland covers, fires unlit, the accumulated neglect of a man who could not see and had perhaps stopped caring what surrounded him. She'd done this not because she expected it to be accurate, but because building and then revising mental images was how she oriented herself. The revision was immediate and substantial. The entrance hall was large and warm and lit by a chandelier that held 24 candles burning with complete commitment. The floors were stone, polished to a low gleam. The staircase that rose at the far end was oak, old and dark, with a banister that had been worn smooth by 2 centuries of hands. There were paintings on the walls, large ones, ancestors and landscapes, hung at precise intervals. There were fresh flowers on the hall table. Fresh flowers. She noted that. Someone maintained fresh flowers in a house inhabited by a man who couldn't see them. Either the staff kept the habit from before, or someone wanted them. Mrs. Denton led her up the stairs and down a corridor to the left, through a door at its end, into a room that stopped her breath slightly. It was not small. It faced west, and in the amber-going afternoon light, the room was the color of old gold, thick drapes pulled back to show the moorland beyond, a 4-poster bed with cream hangings, a writing desk already equipped with paper and ink, a fire burning in the grate with the purpose of a fire that had been attended to recently, intentionally, with care. Your trunks will be brought up, Mrs. Denton said. Your maid will be Agnes, but she'll attend you from 7. The bell pull is to the right of the fireplace. She paused at the door. Is there anything you require? Yes, Vivien said. She was looking at the window, at the moorland going dark beyond it, at the last copper edge of light along the horizon. What is he like? Silence. She turned. Mrs. Denton was in the doorway, her face doing the same thing Thomas's had done in the posting inn. That adjustment, that internal recalibration. That is not mine to say, Mrs. Denton said. Then whose is it? A long moment, and then Mrs. Denton said very precisely, his. The door closed. At exactly 7 o'clock, Vivien walked into the dining room. She had dressed with a deliberateness that surprised even herself. The deep blue evening dress, her mother's pearl earrings, her hair done by the silent and competent Agnes with a simplicity that she preferred to ornament. She had made these choices while sitting with the logic of them. She was arriving at dinner with a man who could not see her, who would hear her instead, feel the room pressure of her, register the quality of her silence and her speech. Her appearance was irrelevant in the direct sense. In every indirect sense, it was entirely for herself. A refusal to show up diminished to this table, regardless of who sat at it. The dining room was long, candlelit, set for 2 at the near end of a table designed for 20. The candles were excessive. She counted them automatically, a habit. 17 on the table and in 2 candelabra against the wall. Excessive for a man who couldn't see. Again she noted it. Again she filed it. He was already there. He stood at the window with his back to her, which was... She worked through that for a half second. Either an affectation designed to seem dramatic or evidence of genuine awareness of her entry through some means other than sight. The window showed nothing but darkness now. He was looking at nothing. Miss Hale, he said without turning. His voice was lower than she'd anticipated. Not performance low, not the manufactured baritone of men who want to seem important. Just the natural register of a voice that had spent a long time not wasting itself on unnecessary volume. It occupied the room without effort. Your Grace, she said. He turned then. She had not been given a description of him. No portrait, no second-hand account more useful than reclusive and dangerous, both of which were the kind of words people use when they mean they simply don't know. What she saw was a man who was, above all else, difficult to look away from, and who was not, in any physical particular, what the word reclusive typically suggested. He was tall, not ostentatiously so, but enough that the room scaled differently around him. His face was, she took the inventory because she always took inventories, angular, precise, the face of someone who'd spent years in an expression between stillness and attention that had settled into the bone. Dark hair, dark coat, simply cut, immaculate. And his eyes, gray, pale, trained in her direction with an accuracy that made her chest do something she immediately cataloged and set aside. Those eyes. They were looking at her, not past her, not through her, at her. Blind men's eyes, in her understanding, did not do that. Blind men's eyes had a quality of unfocus, a direction that was approximated rather than landed. His eyes had landed. They had landed on her with the particular precision of someone who knew exactly where she was standing. She kept her face neutral. She sat down when he gestured toward her chair. She unfolded her napkin. She accepted the wine that was poured. He took his seat across from her. The candles between them threw his face into planes of light and shadow, and his eyes, across the table, remained, she would not stop noticing it, precisely trained in her direction. "You made the journey without difficulty," he said. It was not a question. "I did. Thomas is reliable." "He is. Also discreet." A pause. Something in his face that was not quite a smile. That was a test. An observation. Of his discretion, or of my choice to employ it. She picked up her glass. Both are worth knowing. He was quiet for a moment. In the candlelight, with the silence of the house pressing in around the dining room, Vivien had the sensation she sometimes got in rooms where the person across from her was paying more attention than the situation seemed to call for. She got that sensation now, strongly. "You're not frightened," he said. "I'm at dinner," she said. "I've been frightened." I set it aside. "It's not useful here. Most women in your position—" He stopped himself. Something shifted in his expression. A momentary fault in the precision of it quickly closed. "Forgive me. I was about to make an assumption. About what most women do." "Yes." "Do you know many women in my position, Your Grace?" Another pause, longer this time. "No," he said. The food came. She ate. He ate. There was a quality to the silence between the courses that was not hostile and was not comfortable. It was the silence of two people who are taking the full measure of something they don't yet have language for. She had sat in silences like this before, in the late years of her mother's illness, in her father's study when she was 16 and first starting to understand that the household was structurally doomed, when you are in a room with a truth that isn't ready yet to be spoken, and you have to simply wait for it. She watched him eat. He was precise, economical. His hands moved with the orientation of someone who knew exactly where everything was. Not because he'd memorized the placement, but because he'd tracked it, because he was tracking her across the table the same way. His fork did not stray. His glass came to his hand with the assurance of perfect internal calibration. She picked up her wine glass and moved it, quietly, 4 inches to the left of where it had been sitting, and set it down without sound. She watched his hand come for the glass. His fingers moved to where the glass had been. Found nothing. A pause. Less than a second. Then his hand moved, exactly 4 inches left, and found the stem. He took a drink. Set it down. Did not mention it. Vivien sat very still and felt the bottom of something drop out of her understanding of this room, this man, this situation she'd been placed in. Her heart was doing something deliberate and loud in her chest, and she was not going to let it show on her face, not yet, not while she didn't know what she was looking at. "You have questions," he said. "I have observations," she said carefully. "The questions will follow." He looked at her, that precise landing gaze, and for just a moment the mask of it, the performance of it, whatever it was, almost slipped. Almost. "Mrs. Denton will have told you dinner ends at 9, he said. "I keep early hours. The estate is yours to explore as you choose, within reason. There are parts of the West Wing I would ask you to avoid for now." "For now," she said. "There are ongoing repairs." "Of course." She folded her napkin, placed it beside her plate. Your Grace. Miss Hale. If you were going to have me brought here, she said slowly, precisely, watching his face, and you had no intention of treating me as furniture or as a charity obligation, what exactly did you intend? The candlelight, the silence, the moors outside pressing dark against every window of the house. He looked at her for a long time. That gaze, that impossible landing gaze. I needed, he said, someone in this house who could not be bought. She stared at him. You know nothing about me. I know your father's debts go back 11 years, and you've been managing his accounts for 2 of them. His voice was exactly level. I know you asked Thomas 3 questions about me and recognized when he gave you an evasive answer. I know you moved your glass 4 inches at dinner. The room went very quiet. I know, Lucian Blackthorne said, that you are exactly what I was told you were, and I know that you've already understood something in this room that I cannot afford to have misunderstood. She sat absolutely still. What, she said, is in the West Wing? His jaw set. Something moved behind those gray eyes, something that was not blindness, had never been blindness, and which she understood now with the cold, clean certainty of arithmetic completing itself, and which terrified her not because it was monstrous, but because it was the revelation that she was inside something much larger and much more dangerous than a marriage contract. And she had arrived here alone, with 2 trunks, on a moor at the edge of England, and the man across from her had just, deliberately, calculatedly, shown her enough of the truth to make her complicit before she'd been given the option to refuse. That, he said quietly, is not a question I can answer tonight. From somewhere in the West Wing, muffled, distant, unmistakable, came the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. And then silence. And then footsteps, moving fast. Lucian Blackthorne was already on his feet. Lucian was already moving before the echo of that impact finished traveling down the corridor. Not the careful, deliberate movement of a man navigating by memory and touch. Not the measured step and feel of someone managing darkness, but the fast, direct stride of a man who knew exactly where every door was because he could see them. And Vivien sat at the dinner table for exactly 2 seconds watching him go before she stood up and followed. She didn't decide to follow. That was the part she'd examine later, in the cold accounting of her own choices. The fact that her body had made the decision before her mind caught up, that something in her had registered the sound from the West Wing and registered Lucian moving and had simply gone, because the alternative was sitting at a dinner table with 17 candles and a glass of wine, and whatever was happening in the West Wing was clearly the only true thing in this house, and she was not built for sitting in rooms while true things happened without her. The corridor outside the dining room was lit by wall sconces spaced wide enough apart that the spaces between them were genuine shadow. Lucian was ahead of her. She could hear him, not see him, the sure, quick sound of his boots on the stone floor, no hesitation at the turns, no hand trailing the wall. She kept pace. She didn't call out to him. She didn't ask where they were going. She knew where they were going. He stopped at a door at the far end of the main corridor, a heavy door banded with iron, and he had a key in his hand already. She hadn't seen him take it, hadn't seen it on him at dinner, and he turned it in the lock and pushed through, and she was 4 steps behind him when he turned around and found her. He stared at her. She stared back. "Go to your room," he said. "No." Something crossed his face. Not anger exactly, a tighter thing than anger, the expression of a man who has made careful plans for a situation and is watching those plans fail in real time. "Miss Hale?" "There's someone in this wing," she said. "You heard it before I did, which tells me you were expecting it might happen, which tells me this isn't an accident or an intrusion. So," she held his gaze, "tell me to go to my room again if you want, but understand that I'll simply wait in the corridor instead, and you'll be managing whatever's behind that next door knowing I'm standing 20 feet away without any information." His jaw tightened. He looked at her, that full, precise look, and she understood now what it was, understood the quality of it that had unsettled her all through dinner, because it was the look of someone who saw, completely, without allowance for what he was supposed to not be seen. "Stay behind me," he said. "Do not speak. Do not touch anything." "Understood." He turned and went through the next door. The West Wing was different from the rest of the house in the way that working parts of buildings are always different from presented ones. Lower ceilings, no ornament, the smell of cold stone, and something chemical, faintly sharp, that she couldn't immediately name. The corridor here was narrower. The sconces were fewer and older. Lucien moved through it without a lamp and without hesitation, and she followed in his wake and kept her eyes moving. The door at the corridor's end was ajar. Light came through it. Candlelight, unsteady, the kind that meant the source was disturbed. Lucien pushed it open. The room was a study. Or had been. Once. The bones of it were a study, desk and bookshelves, and a cold fireplace. But someone had pushed the desk to one side, and the center of the room was occupied by a large work table covered in papers, maps, what looked like financial documents, letters with broken seals. On the floor, face down, was a man. He was not dead. He was pushing himself up from the floor as they entered, one arm shaking with the effort, the other pressed against his ribs. He was perhaps 45, gray at the temples, wearing a coat that had been expensive a decade ago. He looked up at Lucien, and his face went through several expressions rapidly, ending on something that was not quite relief. "Crawford," Lucien said. His voice had changed. The register was the same, but the temperature of it had dropped to something arctic. "I tripped," Crawford said. He got to his feet. He was looking at Vivien with an expression she catalogued immediately. Not surprise, not curiosity, something more operational than either. "You tripped," Lucien repeated. "The lamp was out. I couldn't—" Crawford stopped, reorganized. "The correspondence from Alderton arrived. I was reading through it. I thought you'd want to know tonight." "I would have wanted to know at a time of my choosing." Lucien walked to the work table. He did not look at the papers. He looked at Crawford. "Who let you in?" "I have a key." "You had a key." "Present tense requires my agreement." Crawford's expression tightened. He was trying not to look at Vivien and was failing at it in the particular way of someone to whom her presence in this room was significant in a way he hadn't prepared for. "Lucien," he said, lower, "we should speak privately." "You have 30 seconds to tell me what Alderton's correspondence contained," Lucien said. "After that, Thomas will see you out, and your key situation will be resolved permanently." A beat. Crawford's eyes went to Vivien one more time, assessing, calculating, and then back to Lucien. "Harwick is moving faster than we anticipated," he said. "The vote on the inheritance trust. He's called it forward. 6 weeks, not 3 months. And he has Pemberton." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Vivien didn't know the names. She absorbed them anyway, filed them, held them. Harwick, Pemberton, an inheritance trust, a vote called 6 weeks forward. And she watched Lucien's face, and what she saw in it was not alarm. It was something more controlled than alarm, and more dangerous. A man absorbing information he'd anticipated, and finding that anticipating something doesn't make it less costly when it arrives. "Thank you, Crawford," he said. "Good night." Crawford left. He paused in the doorway, and Vivien could see him working up to one more thing, one more question or protest. And then he looked at Lucien's face and decided against it, and went. The room was quiet. The candles on the work table flickered in the draft from the door. Vivien looked at the papers on the table. She didn't touch them. She could see enough from where she stood. Columns of figures, what looked like property deeds. A letter whose visible portion contained the phrase, "as previously arranged," in a handwriting that was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who understood that documents outlasted intentions. "You should go to bed," Lucien said. He was looking at the table, not at her. "You told me," she said carefully, "that you needed someone in this house who couldn't be bought." "I did." "That implies that other people in this house can be, or have been." He said nothing. "Crawford has a key to a room containing what appears to be financial and legal correspondence relating to your estate. He reports to you, but comes in after hours without announcement. That's either trusted access, or it's someone you've allowed close enough that you haven't yet closed the door on them, even though you should." She paused. "Harwick and Pemberton. Are they the men who killed your parents?" He turned and looked at her, full, direct, that landing gaze. "What makes you assume my parents were killed?" Two women at a dinner party 3 years ago discussing your family's accident with quotation marks around the word. She kept her voice even. I was 16 and standing close enough to the potted palm that they'd forgotten I was there. Habit. He was very still. Also, she said, a man who loses his sight to grief and retreats from society for over a decade doesn't pay off a debtor's obligation with a marriage contract for a woman he's never met unless the woman serves a specific purpose. You needed a presence in this house, a credible one, someone who would be here legally, visibly, with a reason to be here that no one would question. A wife, he said. A witness, she said. Or both. The candles, the papers, the smell of cold stone and that faint chemical sharpness she still couldn't name. Vivian Blackthorne stood at the edge of the lamplight and looked at her with eyes that saw everything, had apparently always seen everything, and she felt the full weight of what she had walked into settle onto her shoulders. Not crushing, not yet, but there. Real, measurable. The vote in 6 weeks, she said. What happens if Harwick wins it? The trust controlling my family's primary estate transfers to a committee of which he is the majority voice. Effectively, he controls Blackthorne. The income, the land, the legal standing that comes with it. And the blindness, a pause, is the reason no one has moved against me yet. A blind duke is not a threat. A blind duke's legal capacity can be questioned. A man whose sight is compromised can be managed in the terminology they use. Something moved in his expression, something with iron in it. If they knew I could see, they would have moved against me already, directly. She breathed in slowly. He had been living inside this performance for years, not weeks, years. The cost of that, the daily structural cost of pretending to a fundamental incapacity, the discipline it required, the specific loneliness of it. She didn't know him well enough yet to know what it had done to him, but she was standing in this room at this hour of the night having just understood it, and she was not going to pretend the understanding was simple. Crawford, she said, is complicated. He looked at me like a problem he hadn't planned for. You are, Lucian said, to several people, which is partly the point. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Neither of them looked away, and the candles between them burned with the specific constancy of things that don't know they're being used as metaphor. I need to ask you something, she said. Yes. Did you choose my father specifically, or was his death a coincidence that you shaped? The pause was answer enough before he spoke. Your father's debts were known to me for 8 months before the contract was proposed. She had expected it. She still felt it land. You engineered this. I identified a situation that served both our needs. My need, she said, was not to be sold. Her voice stayed level. She was proud of that. My need was for a father who did not gamble his family into ruin. I didn't have a need for this. I had no options, and you replaced one of them. He didn't deny it. He stood there and received it, and she gave him credit for that, for not constructing an excuse, for not reaching for the language of mutual benefit when what she was describing was an asymmetry. No, he said. You're right. The acknowledgement was so plain that it stopped her. I knew your father's debts, he said. I knew your situation. I knew that you were the one managing his accounts, which meant you were already living inside someone else's disaster and trying to build functional ground in it. I chose you because you are, demonstrably, the kind of person who pays attention when paying attention costs something. He paused. That does not make it just. No, she said, it doesn't. What it makes it, he said, is honest now, which is more than this house has been in 11 years. She was quiet. Outside, wind had come up across the moors. She could hear it in the west wing's older bones, in the places where the stone had settled and the window frames had learned to carry the weather differently. The candles on the work table shivered. Vivien looked at the papers, at the maps, at the careful, deliberate handwriting on the visible letter. She thought about 11 years of performance. She thought about her father's ink-stained hand and the scratch of a pen in a study on Aldermere Street. She thought about the way the room at dinner had scaled differently around this man, the way his gaze had landed and kept landing, The way the glass moved 4 inches, and his hand followed it without a word because concealing what he was had become as automatic as breathing. She thought about the word witness. If Harwick moves in 6 weeks, she said slowly, and you need to demonstrate that your legal capacity is intact, that you are not incapacitated, then the blindness becomes a liability rather than a shield, yes. So at some point you'll have to stop. At some point I'll have to choose the moment to stop. She met his gaze. You'll need me to have seen it, she said, whatever it is that finally exposes them. You'll need a witness who is legally attached to your household and whose testimony cannot be dismissed as partisan. A wife's testimony is complicated, but a wife who is also... She stopped. Something cold moved through her chest. You knew I'd figure it out. You sat at that dinner table and you moved the conversation precisely enough that I would reach the conclusion myself rather than being told it. Because a woman who reasons her way to the truth is more useful than one who was handed it. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. That was its own answer. The thing she felt then was not betrayal. She'd walked into this house without illusions, and she wasn't going to perform them now for the sake of a wound that fit neatly into a familiar shape. What she felt was something colder and more specific, the recognition that she was standing in a room where every wall was a choice that someone else had made, and the only power she had was the one she'd always had in her father's disaster, which was the power of understanding the situation faster than anyone expected her to and refusing to pretend otherwise. All right, she said. He waited. You need a witness. I am legally your wife as of the contract, which means I am already implicated in whatever this is. Leaving doesn't make me safer. It makes me uninformed and isolated, which is worse. She looked at the papers on the table. So tell me about Harwick. Tell me about the trust. Tell me what Alderton's letter actually says, and what Crawford's role is in it, and why a man with a key to this room is being managed rather than dismissed. She looked back at him. If you want someone in this house who cannot be bought, then stop handling me like someone who needs to be led. I don't. Lucian Blackthorne stood in the candlelight of his West Wing study and looked at her for a long time. Something in his face, the permanent precision of it, the 11 years of controlled surface, shifted, not much, just enough that she caught it. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. Yes, he said, and something in his voice was, for the first time, close to dry. I can see that. He moved to the work table. He put his hands flat on it. He looked at the papers. And the specific quality of that look, after everything, after all of it, was still startling, still something she was going to need time to stop reacting to. And he said, Harwick killed my parents for control of an inheritance trust that holds the majority of Blackthorne's generational assets. He has spent 11 years cultivating the legal and social infrastructure to legitimize that control. He has allies in Parliament, a bought judge on the Trust's oversight board, and a network of noblemen who have each been promised a portion of the disbursement once the Trust transfers. He looked up at her. Crawford is one of them. He does not know I know. He believes he is managing me. A pause. He is the evidence. The wind hit the West Wing again. The candles shivered and held. She felt it then. The full shape of it, the architecture of what she had walked into, the scale of what the next 6 weeks would require. The thing that her father's ink-stained hand had signed her into without understanding, without even knowing there was something here to understand. She also felt, with the same cold clarity, that she was already too far in. That the moment she'd followed Lucian through that iron-banded door, the moment she'd stood in this room and listened and begun to reason through it rather than walking away. That was the moment. That had already been the moment. There was no version of this that ended with her standing in a posting inn watching a black carriage drive away. She had been, she understood now, the final piece Lucian Blackthorne had been waiting to place. And he had placed her correctly. The question, the one she was going to have to live inside from this point forward, was whether being placed correctly and choosing to stay were different enough to matter. She pulled out the nearest chair, sat down, looked at the papers on the table between them. Show me the correspondence from Alderton, she said. And somewhere below them, in the body of the house, she heard the front door open and close. And footsteps on the stone floor of the entrance hall, not Thomas, not Mrs. Denton, not any tread she recognized, moving with the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who had been here before and believed they had every right to be here again. Lucien's head came up. His eyes went to the door of the study, and for the first time since she'd met him, Vivian Hale saw something move across Lucien Blackthorne's face that she had not seen there before, something that the 11 years of discipline and performance and careful management had almost entirely succeeded in burying. Fear. The footsteps stopped outside the west wing door. Not the iron-banded door at the corridor's entrance. That one Lucien had locked behind them. This was the door to the study itself, the one Crawford had left through 4 minutes ago, and the footsteps had come from the direction of the main house, which meant whoever this was had a second entrance, a second key, a second piece of access that Lucien had not anticipated or had not adequately controlled. And Vivien watched his face in the candlelight and understood from the specific quality of his stillness that it was the latter. He had known there was a second key. He had not known it would be used tonight. The door opened. The man who came through it was not what she expected, and she understood immediately upon seeing him that she had been, without knowing it, building expectations. Some image of Harwick as the villain required, the cold-eyed aristocrat with the bearing of someone who had decided long ago that other people's losses were simply his gains not yet collected. What came through the door instead was a man of perhaps 60 who looked like someone's benevolent uncle, heavy through the shoulders, silver-haired, with a broad face that was organized around an expression of permanent, reasonable concern. He was well-dressed. His boots were excellent. He had the hands of someone who had never needed to use them for anything urgent. He looked at Lucien, then at Vivien, then back at Lucien, and the reasonable concern on his face shifted into something that was still wearing the same mask but had different eyes behind it now. "Lucien," he said, warmly, "I apologize for the hour. Crawford sent word there was a development. I came directly." "Crawford sent word," Lucien said. "He was concerned. You know how he is." The man's gaze moved to Vivien again, and this time it stayed. "This must be your bride. I heard the carriage arrived this afternoon." He smiled. It reached nothing above his jaw. "Lord Harwick, I was a close friend of your husband's father. I've known Lucien since he was a boy." Vivien looked at him. She said nothing. Harwick waited a moment for the social reciprocity that did not come, then turned back to Lucien. "Crawford mentioned the Alderton correspondence arrived. I thought we should discuss it together, given the timeline." "Crawford," Lucien said again, "is not your messenger. Crawford is a practical man who understands that some situations require—" "Get out of my house!" The temperature of the room changed. Harwick's expression didn't fracture. It was too practiced for that. But something behind it recalculated, the way a chess player recalculates when a piece moves unexpectedly. "Lucien." Lower now, and carrying the specific register of a man who has spent years using a younger man's first name as a tool of condescension, of implied authority, of "you are still the boy I knew, and I am still the man who managed your tragedy for you." "This isn't the time for—" "Thomas." Lucien hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Thomas appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, which meant he'd been close, which meant Lucien had anticipated needing him and had positioned him accordingly. Vivien filed this. Even now. Even with fear visible in him for the first time, Lucien had been 3 steps ahead on the operational details. "Lord Harwick is leaving," Lucien said. Harwick looked at Thomas, looked at Lucien. The reasonable concern on his face had resolved into something that was simply cold now, the mask given up for the moment because they were past the point where the mask was the right instrument. "The vote has been moved to 5 weeks," he said. "Not 6. Pemberton has the last 2 signatures. You should think carefully, Lucien, about what position you want to be in when that meeting occurs. A blind duke managing a complex estate. There are questions, you understand, about capacity, about whether the trust's assets are being properly administered, questions that reasonable men might raise." He glanced at Vivien. "A hasty marriage to an unknown woman doesn't quiet those questions. It raises them." He left. Thomas went with him, the sound of the iron-banded door at the corridor's end, then nothing. Vivien sat with the silence for a moment. Then she said, "He already knows about the vote change?" "Yes." Which means Crawford told him before he told you. Yes. How long has Crawford been his? Lucian's hands were still flat on the work table. He was looking at them. I don't know when it turned. Crawford worked for my father. He stayed after, I thought, out of loyalty or, at minimum, out of the kind of inertia that keeps people in positions they've occupied for 20 years. He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved once. I should have known sooner. You did know, she said. You've been managing him rather than dismissing him because a man you're watching is more valuable than one who disappears and operates beyond your sight. She caught the word. Didn't let herself stop on it. But Harwick has had him longer than you knew, or more completely than you estimated. One of those. Both, probably. But she looked at the Alderton correspondence, now in her hands where she'd picked it up when Harwick came through the door. An instinct. The same instinct that had always made her pick up the household accounts when someone distressed entered a room, because if the documents were in her hands, they were not on the table being observed. She read it now properly. Alderton was a solicitor. His letter was careful and professional and contained, in its precise legal language, something that hit her like cold water. A formal notice that the Trust's Oversight Board had received a petition, signed by Harwick, Pemberton, and 3 others whose names she didn't recognize, challenging the current administration of the Blackthorne estate on grounds of the Duke's incapacity. Not future incapacity. Current. With documentation attached. Medical attestation from a physician named Greer dated 8 months prior, affirming that the Duke of Blackthorne suffered from permanent and complete blindness, affecting his ability to manage complex financial and legal instruments without substantial assistance. The documentation was real. The physician was real. The attestation described in careful clinical language a man who could not read documents, who required all correspondence to be read aloud, who navigated his own household by memorized routine, who was, in the physician's considered opinion, dependent on his staff for any function requiring visual acuity. Every word of it was, technically, a description of the performance. Every word of it was, as evidence, devastating. Dr. Greer, she said, examined me 4 years ago. I was performing at that point. He paused. He is honest. He recorded what he observed. And Harwick has held this document for 4 years and is only using it now. He needed the right moment. A challenged trust administration requires a formal hearing. A formal hearing requires witnesses, testimonies, a legal record. Lucien moved away from the table. He went to the fireplace, cold, no fire laid in this room, and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she could see the shape of what this cost him in the set of his shoulders, the very deliberate way he was holding himself together. He waited until he had Parliament allies and a judge, and enough signatures that the hearing would be a formality. He waited until he could make the outcome certain before he moved. 5 weeks, she said. 5 weeks. Which means Crawford told him about the Alderton letter tonight so that he could come here and show you how far along it is. Not to negotiate, to demonstrate. She set the letter down. He wanted you to know you've already lost. Lucien turned. She had expected, she didn't know what she'd expected. Anger, maybe, or the controlled version of it that she was beginning to understand was his default register for difficult things. What she saw was something more stripped than that. A man who had spent 11 years building a defense so intricate and so sustained that the cost of it had become invisible to him, had simply become the condition of existing, and who was now looking at the evidence that it had not been enough. That someone had been patient longer than he had, that Harwick had simply waited, and waiting had been the correct strategy. Crawford will testify, Lucien said, at the hearing. He'll describe the estate's operations from the inside. He'll confirm the attestation. He has 11 years of observations. A pause. He has seen me not see things. I gave him access because I needed him to believe the performance, and he believed it fully, which means his testimony will be entirely genuine. The specific cruelty of that. The trap that closed from the inside. There's a witness problem, Vivien said. Yes. The performance was the problem. You needed people to believe it, so you performed for everyone, including the people closest to you, and now the people closest to you are the evidence against you. She was thinking through it as she spoke, the way she'd thought through her father's accounts when the numbers had first shown her the scope of the disaster. Not panicking, just following the arithmetic wherever it led, even when it led somewhere she didn't want to go. You need a counter-witness, someone who can testify that the Duke of Blackthorne can see, who has observed it directly, recently, under circumstances that can be verified. Yes, he said. That is what I need. She looked at him. He looked at her. The candles between them had burned lower. The room was the same temperature as the stone outside, and the wind was in the moors, and it was after 9 o'clock on the first night of her life as Vivian Blackthorne, Duchess of, and she was sitting in a study in the West Wing with a man who had engineered her presence here for exactly this purpose, and who was looking at her now with the full force of that gray, seeing gaze and not pretending otherwise. You need me to testify, she said. I need you to be willing to testify. I cannot compel you, even as your... He stopped, reconsidered the word. Even under the contract, I cannot compel your testimony. No, she said. You can't. She stood up. She walked to the window. The moors beyond were a pure and absolute darkness, the kind that isn't threatening so much as it is simply indifferent, the darkness of landscape that predates human arrangements and will outlast them. She stood there looking at it for a moment. She thought about her mother, about the specific quality of her mother's death, which had been slow and has been managed by a family in financial decline, which meant it had been managed badly. In a house going cold because the fuel budget had been quietly reduced, with a physician who came less frequently as the bills grew, and her father sitting at the end of the corridor with his hands on his face while she, Vivien, at 14, had been the one in the room. She had learned there, in that room, in that particular education, that you are either the person who is in the room when things require it, or you are the person sitting outside with your hands on your face, and only one of those is a choice you can live with afterward. She was already in the room. She had followed him through the iron-banded door. She had picked up the letter. She had sat down at the table and asked him to show her the correspondence. She was already in the room, and the only question was whether she was going to be useful in it. I watched you move directly to this wing, she said, still facing the window. I watched you unlock that door without touching the walls. I watched you walk this corridor in the dark without hesitation. I watched your eyes find mine across the dinner table and stay there with a precision that no blind man could sustain. She paused. I moved your glass 4 inches, and your hand followed it in the same moment you pretended not to notice. I have been watching you see things since I walked into that dining room. She turned. My testimony would not be forced or coached. It would be the account of a woman who was paying attention from the first moment she arrived in this house. That's the kind of testimony that survives cross-examination. Something moved through Lucian's face, through the whole careful architecture of him. A fracture, small, real. Why? He said. She looked at him directly. Because Harwick killed your parents and spent 11 years building a legal mechanism to take everything they left. And because the system he's using is the same system my father used. Debt, documentation, the slow structural suffocation of someone with fewer resources than you, arranged to look like the natural outcome of incompetence. The anger in her voice was clean, not hot, the anger that lives below the temperature of fury. I have watched that system work my entire life. I am not going to watch it work here. He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. There's more, he said. You need to know all of it before you agree. Tell me. The physician Harwick will bring to the hearing. Greer is the public attestation, but there is a second physician, one he's kept in reserve. Lucien moved to the work table. He pulled a document from beneath the Alderton correspondence, something she hadn't seen, something that had been under the other papers deliberately. This arrived 3 days ago, before you came. I should have told you before dinner. I was managing the disclosure. She took it. It was not a legal document. It was a letter, handwritten, the handwriting uneven in a way that suggested age or illness or both, signed at the bottom with the name Whitmore. She read it. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at Lucien. This physician, she said. Whitmore. He treated you in the year following your parents' deaths. Yes. And he documented during that period genuine loss of sight. Lucienne said nothing. She felt the cold come up through her chest. You were actually blind. For 14 months. His voice was exactly flat. The physicians at the time had no explanation. There was no injury, no disease they could identify. It resolved, slowly, incompletely at first, then fully. Over the following year, I've had full sight for 9 years. He paused. Whitmore's records document the genuine blindness. Harwick has obtained those records. He will use them to argue that the Duke's current incapacity is a continuation of the original condition, that any claim of recovered sight is fabricated for legal purposes. She stood completely still. The architecture of the trap was extraordinary. Harwick had a genuine historical record of real blindness. He had a recent medical attestation of a performance so complete that the physician who'd conducted it had no reason to doubt it. He had Crawford's 11 years of observation. He had Parliament allies, and a bought judge, and 5 weeks, and the legal apparatus of an inheritance trust that had been designed, she now understood, not as a protection for the Blackthorne estate, but as the instrument of its transfer. And against all of that, Lucienne had her, a woman he'd brought here through a contract signed by a desperate man, present for fewer than 12 hours, who had no legal history with this family, no documented standing, and whose testimony would be immediately challenged as the motivated account of a new wife protecting her husband's title. He's going to say I'm lying, she said. Yes. He's going to say you coached me, that the marriage itself was engineered to produce a convenient witness. Yes. Which is true. A silence. Yes, Lucienne said. It is. She breathed. The wind hit the house. A candle on the table guttered and held and guttered again. Everything her father had done to her. Every small subordination of her needs to his crisis. Every year she'd spent managing a disaster she hadn't created. Every morning she'd done the accounts and found the numbers worse than the morning before. Had built in her, over time, a specific capacity. The ability to stand in a room where the situation was genuinely bad, where the numbers did not work, where there was no version of the arithmetic that produced a comfortable outcome, and to keep thinking anyway. To not stop. To find the one thing that moved and press on it. She pressed. Whitmore's letter, she said. He sent it to you, not to Harwick. Harwick doesn't know I have it. Whitmore sent copies to both of us. An old man's conscience, I think. He is dying. He wanted the record complete on both sides. Then Whitmore can testify. He's dying, Vivien. Is he dead? A beat. No. Then he can testify. A physician who documented the original blindness and who has, presumably, given that he sent you this letter, some knowledge of the recovery. A man with nothing to gain because he is dying. She picked up the letter again. Where is he? Bath. We have 5 weeks. She looked at him. I can travel to Bath in 2 days. I can be back in 4. If Whitmore will speak to me, if he'll agree to submit a formal account to the oversight board, Harwick will move to discredit him. Harwick will try, but a dying physician whose own records confirm both the blindness and the recovery is a different problem for Harwick than a convenient wife. She set the letter down with a precision that was its own kind of emphasis. This is the move. You know it is. Lucienne looked at her. In the candle-ruined light of a study in a house on the moors, 11 years of careful construction showing its first cracks, this man who had planned for every contingency except the one where his contingency plans ran out. He looked at her, and she saw him make a decision. If you go to Whitmore, he said, and Harwick discovers it before we can file the physician's account, he will not simply move to discredit you. He will move to remove you from the equation. She felt the weight of that settle. Remove, she said. He had my parents killed, Lucienne said quietly, because they were in the way of what he wanted. You would be in the way of what he wants. The room was very quiet. She was 19 years old. She had arrived in this house 8 hours ago with 2 trunks and her mother's silver brush set and a copy of Middlemarch. She had been sold for £11,000 to settle a debt she had not incurred. She had come here believing she was entering a marriage, and she was standing instead at the center of something that had been in motion for 11 years and that carried, apparently, a specific and mortal risk to anyone who obstructed it. She could feel the pull of the sensible thing, the thing that looked like self-preservation, that looked like refusal, that looked like the very reasonable position of a young woman who had been placed here through no choice of her own and who was under no obligation, moral or legal, to walk into further danger on behalf of a man who had engineered her arrival for his own strategic purposes. She could feel that pull. She recognized it. She also knew, with the cold, clean certainty of someone who had spent years watching what the sensible thing cost, that there was no version of stepping back from this room in which she was safe. Harwick had already seen her face, had already registered her presence here as a variable, had already looked at her across a candlelit study with those eyes that calculated behind the reasonable mask. She was already in this. The only question was whether she was in it with information or without it. She picked up Whitmore's letter and folded it and put it inside the front cover of the notebook she'd brought from her room, the one she used for figures, the one that was already in her coat pocket because she'd put it there when she dressed for dinner without knowing why. Just the habit of keeping the thing for numbers close. "Tell me everything you know about Harwick's network," she said. "Every name, every connection, the judge, the parliament men, whatever you have on Pemberton, all of it tonight." She looked up. "And then tomorrow morning, I need to speak to Mrs. Denton about which of the staff can be trusted and which cannot, because if Crawford is Harwick's, then I need to know who else in this house has been watching you for someone else." Lucy Yen stared at her. "Now," she said, "we don't have time." And he told her. For 3 hours, in a cold study in the west wing of Blackthorne Manor, while the moors pressed dark against every window and the candles burned to their stubs one by one, he told her all of it, names and dates and financial arrangements and the specific mechanics of how a man dismantles a dukedom from the inside out over 11 years, how you buy a judge and cultivate a parliament vote and use a dead man's trust document as the instrument of his son's dispossession. He told her, and she wrote it in the notebook in her tight, efficient hand, the hand she'd developed doing her father's accounts in margins too small for the numbers. She wrote until the last candle guttered. Then she wrote in the dark, by feel, because she'd learned that too, how to keep the numbers moving when the light ran out. At 2 a.m, Lucien said her name. She looked up. He was looking at her, that gaze, that impossible landing gaze, and his face in the near dark had lost all of its performance, had lost the 11-year architecture of the Blind Duke, and what was under it was something she hadn't seen yet, something younger and less defended and more costly to look at directly. "Why are you doing this?" he said. Not the way he'd asked before, different now, genuine. She held his gaze for a long moment. "Because someone should have," she said. She closed the notebook. She stood. She walked to the door. She was 3 steps into the corridor when she heard it. Not from inside the house this time, but from outside, from the direction of the stables. And it was not a sound she could immediately categorize until the smell reached her 2 seconds later, coming in cold through the gap under the West Wing's ancient window frames. Sharp, chemical. The smell she hadn't been able to name since she arrived. Lamp oil. And then, beneath the window at the far end of the corridor, the first thin line of orange light. Lucien was past her before the word lamp oil had finished forming in her mind. Not running, something more controlled than running, the movement of a man who had already processed the information and was acting on it while she was still catching up. And she followed him the length of the corridor to the window at its far end where the orange line had become, in the 40 seconds since she'd first seen it, something wider and less theoretical. The stables were 30 yards from the West Wing's outer wall. The nearest structure. The fire was in the stable's eastern corner, climbing the dry timber of the hayloft with the fast, committed movement of a fire that had been given help. Not an accident, not an ember from a careless lantern, but a fire that had been started with the specific intention of spreading, and was doing so. "The horses," she said. "Thomas." Lucien had already turned from the window, already moving back up the corridor at a pace that forced her to break into something close to a run to match him. "Thomas handles the horses. We need the document room." "The document room, the original trust papers, my father's correspondence. Everything that can counter the hearing is in this wing, And if this fire reaches the house, she understood. She was already moving. The document room was back the way they'd come, past the study, through a connecting door she hadn't noticed when they'd first come through because it was set flush with the paneling and had no visible handle, just a small brass mechanism at knee height. Lucien hit it without breaking stride, and the door swung inward, and she followed him into a room that was smaller than the study and contained, on 4 walls of shelving from floor to ceiling, the accumulated paper record of a family's legal existence. "The green ledgers," he said. "Top shelf, far wall. The black correspondence boxes, 3 of them, labeled by year. Get those first." She was already pulling a chair to the far wall. She climbed it, reached the green ledgers, 4 of them, heavy, and she understood the moment she opened the top one to check it. That these were the original trust documents. Her father's handwriting style had taught her to read legal financial records fast, and these were exactly what they were, irreplaceable. And if Harwick had started this fire knowing this room existed, then this was the point of the fire. Not Lucien, not the house, these papers. She pulled them and handed them down, and Lucien stacked them against his chest with one arm and kept his other hand free, and she climbed back for the black boxes. Smoke was not yet in the room, but she could smell it. The specific mineral quality of old timber burning coming in under the connecting door from the corridor beyond. The fire was moving fast. Whoever had set it knew what they were doing and had given it enough fuel to establish itself before anyone noticed. She got the boxes down, 3 of them, each weighing more than she'd expected, and she carried 2 under one arm and held the third against her chest and dropped off the chair, and they went back through the paneled door into the corridor, and the smoke was visible now, low and gray-white, coming from the direction of the window where the fire outside had found the west wing's outer wall and begun its negotiation with the building's edge. "Main house," Lucien said, "through the dining room corridor, close every door behind you." "What are you doing?" He'd handed her the green ledgers. She had both arms full now, the ledgers and the boxes, an impossible stack that she was holding through some combination of mechanics and refusal. "There are people in this house," he said. "I need to account for them." "The staff—" "Crawford," he said. "Crawford is in this house, and I don't know where." She stared at him. "Go," he said. "Main house. Lock the connecting door from the other side." "I am not locking you in a burning—" "Vivien." He looked at her directly, that landing gaze, the full force of it, and she understood this was not a request or a strategic suggestion, but a man telling her that he needed her to be the part of this that was safe, that the only way he could do what needed to be done in this wing was knowing she was on the other side of a locked door. "The documents. Go." She went. The corridor to the dining room was thick with the first gray filtering of smoke by the time she cleared the west wing's connecting door, and she turned and threw the bolt behind her, the clunk of it, the loneliest sound she'd heard all night, and she moved through the dining room with the ledgers and boxes pressing into her arms, through the entrance hall where 2 of the household maids were already on the stairs in nightclothes, faces white, and she said to them sharply, "Out the front. Now, go to the carriage house and stay there." And they went, and she kept moving. She got the documents to the entrance hall table, set them there, turned back. She'd told him she'd locked the door. She had locked the door. She had not told him she was going to stay on the other side of it. The smoke in the entrance hall was still light. The fire was contained to the west wing's outer wall and the stable and had not yet reached the interior corridors. And she went back through the dining room with her eyes watering slightly and unbolted the connecting door and went through it and into the west wing corridor. And the smoke here was real now, real enough to feel in the throat. And she pulled the neck of her evening dress up over her nose and moved. She heard them before she saw them. Crawford's voice first, high and cracked in a way it hadn't been in the study. The voice of a man who has been caught in the middle of something and is trying to reverse the direction of it. And then another voice she didn't know, low and hard, and then Lucien's, and then a sound that was not voices. She came around the far bend of the corridor and stopped. Crawford was against the wall. The man with the low voice was between Crawford and the door at the corridor's end. A big man, wide through the chest, wearing a working coat, not a servant's livery, not a gentleman's clothing, the coat of someone who had come here to do a specific physical job and had dressed for it. He had his arm across Crawford's chest, and Crawford was not fighting it. was in fact the particular kind of still that people are when they understand the situation has moved past the point where their participation is voluntary. Lucien was 4 feet from them, and he had something in his hand. It took her a moment to identify it in the smoke-filtered light of the corridor's remaining sconce. A fire iron from the West Wing study, heavy, the kind of tool that is made with no other purpose in mind but managing fire and is, incidentally, effective at other things. The big man looked at Lucien with the professional assessment of someone calculating weight and reach and probability. "Harwick wants the papers," he said. Not to Crawford, to Lucien. The directness of a man who's been given a job and is not invested in the pretense around it. "Harwick," Lucien said, "can present himself in person if he wants something from this house. The papers, or the wing burns entire and it doesn't matter." Crawford made a sound. Not words, just the compressed noise of a man who is understanding, possibly for the first time, that he has been useful to Harwick up to a specific point, and that point has been reached. "He said there wouldn't be—" Crawford started. "Shut up," the big man said. Vivien stood in the bend of the corridor. The smoke was thicker here, enough that her eyes were streaming steadily, and she had maybe 30 seconds before it was too thick to see clearly in this section of the passage, and she was looking at the situation with the same cold arithmetic she'd been applying to situations all her life, and what it produced was, Lucien had a fire iron and the reach advantage, the big man had Crawford and the weight advantage, and was currently closer to the corridor door that led outside, and she was standing 10 feet back in the smoke, with nobody's attention on her and the black correspondence box she'd been holding when she came through the door still in her hands. She did not deliberate. Deliberation was for rooms where you had time. She crossed the 10 feet in silence and brought the correspondence box into contact with the back of the big man's head with both hands and the full weight of her body behind it. The box was iron-reinforced at the corners. The sound it made was specific and conclusive. The big man went down. Crawford went with him, the arm across his chest suddenly not an arm anymore. And Crawford hit the wall and slid, and Vivien stepped back, and her heart was doing something violent and irregular in her chest, and her hands were shaking around the dented corner of the box. Lucien looked at her. She looked at him. "I said lock the door," he said. "I did lock the door." She set the box down carefully. Her hands were still shaking. "I unlocked it after." Something moved across his face that was not anger. Was not anger at all. He crouched beside the big man, breathing, unconscious, would wake with a significant headache and some explaining to do, and efficiently went through his coat pockets and produced a folded paper and a second key, which he pocketed, and the folded paper he opened and read standing, and his face, as he read it, went through a change that was not like any previous change she'd seen in it. Not the controlled precision, not the fear, something that was more fundamental than either. "What is it?" she said. He held it out. It was an instruction sheet, typed, not handwritten, specific. It listed the document room by name. Someone had known exactly what the room contained and where it was. And it listed, below the instruction to retrieve the truss materials, a secondary instruction that was 3 words and was written with the same professional brevity as everything above it. She read it again. The secondary instruction was, leave no witnesses. Crawford, sitting against the wall with his knees drawn up and his face the color of old wax, had apparently also read it over Lucien's shoulder because he made a sound that was entirely involuntary. The sound of a man understanding that the people he had been serving regarded him as a loose end. The smoke was thickening. The fire outside was vocal now. She could hear it. The specific voice of a fire that has committed to a structure, the low structural groan of the stable's roof taking the heat. "We need to move," she said. "Crawford." Lucien's voice was not kind. "Get up." Crawford got up. His legs were not steady. "You're going to walk out of this house," Lucien said, "and you're going to go directly to the carriage house, and you're going to stay there. In the morning, you are going to give me a complete written account of everything Harwick has asked you to do, observe, or report over the last 11 years. Every conversation, every instruction, every document you provided access to." He paused. "You do this, and I will consider your situation. You don't do this, and the instruction sheet goes to a magistrate tonight." Crawford stared at him. The calculation in his face was the calculation of a man who has just watched his safety net get cut and is looking down. "He'll know I talked," Crawford said. "He already knows you failed," Lucian said. "The papers are gone. The man he sent is unconscious on the floor. You have nothing left to protect by staying loyal to him." He held Crawford's gaze. "Go." Crawford went. They went through the connecting door, Lucian pulling it closed behind them and wedging it with the hall chair from the entrance. Not enough to stop the fire if it reached there, but enough to slow the smoke. And they came into the entrance hall with the documents still on the table and the front door standing open where the maids had gone through it. And outside, the sky above the stable was orange lit, and the sound of the fire was loud enough now to be part of the air itself. The staff were assembled at the carriage house. Thomas had gotten the horses out, 6 of them, moved to the field behind, standing in the orange-lit dark with the specific insulted dignity of horses who have been woken at wrong hours. Mrs. Denton was there. The 2 maids. A stable boy, singed along one forearm, who Thomas was attending to with the focused competence of a man who has dealt with worse. Vivien put the documents into Thomas's hands and told him to put them in the traveling box under the carriage seat, which he did without question, and she watched him do it and thought, that's what it looks like when someone is actually loyal. Not Crawford's performance. This. The automatic movement of a person who has decided where they stand and acts from it without recalculating. She turned. Lucian was standing at the carriage house door looking at the stable. The fire was at its full height now. The roof had gone. The orange collapsing inward in a long, slow architectural surrender, the heat reaching them 40 yards away as a physical pressure against the face and hands. He was watching it with an expression she couldn't parse immediately. And then she could. And it was grief. Not for the stable, but for the 11 years of careful construction that this fire represented the end of the performance, the end of the shield. Because by morning, Harwick would know his man had failed, and would know why, and the blindness would no longer function as protection. The Blind Duke had a wife who'd hit a man with a correspondence box. Whatever Lucian had been before tonight, he was something different after it, and the difference was not deniable. She went and stood beside him. They stood there in the heat and the orange light and the noise of the fire, and she did not say anything, and he did not say anything. And after a moment his hand found hers. Not reached for it, not reached, just found it, the way his hand had found the wine glass 4 inches from where it should have been, with the precision of a man who knows exactly where things are. She didn't pull away. "In the morning," he said. "In the morning," she agreed. In the morning, there would be a magistrate and a correspondence box with an instruction sheet, and Crawford's testimony, and 5 weeks, and Harwick. In the morning, there would be the full weight of what this night had been and what it was going to require from both of them to answer it. But that was morning. Right now, the stable was burning, and the horses were standing in the field, and Thomas was wrapping a stable boy's arm, and somewhere behind them, the traveling box under the carriage seat held the documents that held the truth. And it was enough. For this hour, it was enough. She had been in this house for less than a day. She had arrived with 2 trunks and her mother's silver brush set and 11,000 pounds of someone else's debt. She had not chosen any of it. She had, however, chosen this specific standing here, in the heat and the light, with her hand in the hand of a man who had engineered her presence and had not, when it came to the moment, pretended otherwise. There was a kind of math to that which she couldn't do quickly. Too many variables, too many unknowns, and the accounting of what had passed between them in the space of a single night was not the kind that resolved in hours. But she had not chosen wrong. She was certain of that much. She was still certain of it 40 minutes later when a rider came up the Blackthorne approach road at a speed that said urgency and stopped at the carriage house, and Thomas went out to him and came back with a folded message and handed it to Lucian without expression. Lucian opened it, read it. The fire iron was still in his other hand. She watched his grip on it change. "What?" she said. He held the message out. It was from Harwick's house. She knew the handwriting. She had seen it twice in the correspondence on the work table, the particular deliberate script of a man who understood documents as weapons. The message was 3 sentences. The first sentence said that the Oversight Board had called an emergency session for 6 o'clock the following morning. Not 5 weeks hence, but tomorrow, predicated on evidence of imminent mismanagement at the Blackthorne estate, as evidenced by tonight's fire, and the injury to a board-contracted investigator on Duke Blackthorne's premises. The second sentence said that the Duke's attendance was required. Failure to appear would be treated as evidence of incapacity. The third sentence said, "Bring your wife, if you believe she has anything useful to say." Vivien looked up from the paper. Lucien was looking at the approach road, at the darkness beyond the orange light, where the road went back through the oak tunnel and out toward the world that Harwick had spent 11 years arranging to his own design. 6 hours. They had 6 hours. A correspondence box under a carriage seat, an unconscious man in the West Wing corridor, a dying physician in Bath they hadn't reached yet, Crawford's testimony they hadn't yet taken, and a board session that had been engineered to be a formality, a closing of a door that had been swinging toward them for 11 years. And Lucien Blackthorne turned from the burning stable and looked at her. In the orange light with the fire behind him and the sky going to the first gray suggestion of early morning above the moors, without the performance, without the 11-year architecture of the Blind Duke, he was simply what he was. A man who had fought a very long war with very specific weapons and had just run out of the ones he'd counted on, looking at the one variable in this situation that he had not fully calculated and that had turned out to be, against all his careful planning, the thing he needed most. "Tell me," he said, "that you have an idea." She looked at him, at the message, at the glow of the stable behind them and the documents under the carriage seat and the darkness of the road ahead. Her notebook was still in her coat pocket. She could feel the edge of it against her ribs. 3 hours of Harwick's network in her handwriting, every name and date and connection, and Whitmore's letter folded inside the front cover, and the specific thing she'd written at the top of the third page when Lucien had told her about the trust board structure, which was a question she'd noted and not yet had time to ask. Who appointed the judge? Because if Harwick had bought the judge, someone had sold him. And if someone had sold him, there was a record of the transaction. And if there was a record of the transaction, it was the kind of record that people kept not out of sentiment, but out of protection. The kind of record you keep because the man you sold something to is powerful, and you need something to hold over him in case he decides you're a liability. Blackmail was its own kind of double-entry bookkeeping. It always balanced. "Yes," she said, "I have an idea." She opened the notebook. And somewhere on the road between Blackthorne Manor and London, a carriage with Harwick's crest on the door was moving at speed toward the city, carrying a man who had just received word that the night had not gone as planned, and who was making, in the dark interior of that carriage, his own calculations, and who did not yet know that the variable he had dismissed, the girl sold for £11,000, the convenient wife, the planned witness, had spent the last 3 hours filling a notebook with his name. The carriage left Blackthorne Manor at 4 in the morning. Thomas drove. Lucien sat across from Vivien with the correspondence box on the seat beside him and the fire iron, which no one had thought to put down during the preceding hour, propped against the carriage wall with the mild absurdity of an object that had served its purpose and not yet been returned to its category. The moors went past the windows in the dark, indistinct, the long, flat breathing of landscape that doesn't know or care what's happening inside the small, lit box moving through it. Vivien had the notebook open on her knee. She was writing by the carriage lamp, filling in the gaps in what Lucien had told her, cross-referencing the names against what she'd read in the Alderton letter and in the trust documents she'd pulled from the shelves. Her handwriting at 4 in the morning was smaller and more compressed than usual, but still exact. She had her mother's instinct for exactness, had identified it as her mother's only recently, in the way that you only recognize inherited things once the person you inherited them from is gone, and the trait has nowhere to land but in you. Lucien was watching her write. She felt his attention the way she'd felt it from the first, that particular quality of observation that had been the initial signal, the thing her body had registered before her mind had caught up. He was watching her the way people watch things they are trying to understand, and she understood that the watching was not strategic anymore. It had been, at the start. It wasn't now. "The judge?" she said without looking up. "Alderton's letter mentions the Oversight Board's composition, but not the appointment history. Who put Caldwell on the board?" "My father's solicitor at the time. A man named Fitch, who died 2 years after my parents." "Conveniently." "Yes." But Caldwell's appointment predates Harwick's influence on the board by 8 months. She wrote that. So either Harwick had influence we haven't documented as early as 8 months before your parents died, or Caldwell was placed by someone else, and Harwick acquired him later. She paused. If he acquired him, there's a transaction, a moment of purchase. Caldwell is 63 years old and has been on that board for 12 years. Men of 63 who've been bought don't stay bought out of loyalty. They stay bought because the person who bought them has something. She looked up. Has anyone looked at Caldwell's finances? Lucien was still watching her. No. We need someone at the session today who can introduce that question formally. Not us. It can't come from us. We're the interested party. We need a board member who isn't Harwick's. Ellsworth, Lucien said. He's been on the board since my father's appointment. He's old and he's not brave, but he's not Harwick's. I don't believe Harwick has him. You don't believe. Ellsworth has 3 daughters, all married well, and a reasonable estate in Hampshire. He has nothing Harwick needs and nothing Harwick can threaten. He's been abstaining from contested votes for 8 years, which reads as cowardice but might simply be a man waiting for the side he agrees with to have enough to stand on. She looked at him. Can you reach him before 6? Thomas can. She turned to the window and knocked twice on the carriage wall. Thomas's voice came back. Your Grace? She said Ellsworth's name and address, which Lucien gave her and told Thomas to go there first. A pause. Then, yes, ma'am. And the carriage changed direction slightly. Ma'am. She noted it, noted what it represented, the household's quiet, practical transfer of orientation, not toward Lucien less, but toward her as well. She had apparently, in the space of a night and a fire and a correspondence box used as a weapon, become someone Thomas calibrated for without being asked. She went back to the notebook. Lucien said quietly, You should sleep. I'll sleep after. After is several hours away. Then I'll sleep after several hours. She turned a page. Tell me everything you remember about the night your parents died. Not the official account. What you actually know. A silence. She didn't look up. She gave him the silence to work through. They were traveling from London, he said. The route was the Northern Post Road, which they'd taken dozens of times. The carriage went off a bridge embankment in conditions that the postmaster's report described as clear and dry. He paused. The driver died in the crash. The horses were uninjured. She wrote, Horses uninjured in a crash that killed 2 passengers and a driver. Yes. A carriage that goes off a bridge embankment in clear, dry conditions with uninjured horses has been helped off, she said. The horses stop. Something stops the horses and the carriage continues. She looked up. There would have been an investigation. There was. It found negligence on the driver's part. The driver being dead, the finding was convenient. Who conducted it? He said a name she didn't know. She wrote it. Connected to Harwick. His wife's brother. She held Lucien's gaze for a moment. 11 years. The architecture of it, laid out in the lamp-lit carriage at 4 a.m, was enormous and intricate, and had been built by a man who operated on the assumption that thorough was the same as permanent. Harwick had been thorough. He had simply not accounted for the variable of a dying physician's conscience, or for Crawford's miscalculation of his own expendability, or for a girl sold for £11,000 who had grown up doing the accounting for a disaster and knew exactly how to read a set of books, where the numbers had been arranged to mislead. The investigation finding, she said. Is it in the public record? Yes. Then it can be challenged, not reversed, not today, but challenged, introduced as a question at the session, as evidence of a pattern. She closed the notebook. Harwick's strategy has always been documentation. He's built his case on paper. His weakness is that so has he. Every arrangement, every appointment, every purchase leaves a record somewhere because men like Harwick don't trust verbal agreements. They trust paper, and paper goes both ways. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You've been doing this your whole life. She looked at him. Reading situations, he said, finding the number that doesn't add up. Going through someone else's disaster and locating the one thing that can be moved. My father's disaster, she said. 12 years of practice. It wasn't your disaster to manage. No, she said. It wasn't. He received that, did not look away from it. I owe you an accounting, he said, of what I took from you by engineering this. I know that. I am not. He stopped. I've spent 11 years inside a strategy, inside a performance. After long enough, a man starts to think in those terms for everything. Everyone becomes a position on a board. Everyone becomes a piece that serves a function. He held her gaze. You were a piece that served a function. You remained one in my thinking longer than was just. I want you to know that I know that. She sat with it. The carriage rocked on the northern road, the horses steady in the dark. Thomas on the box with the quiet competence that was his own kind of constancy. I know, she said. You told me the truth when I pressed you. You didn't construct a justification. She paused. I've lived with a man who justified everything, who had a reason for every choice that made the choice not his fault. You didn't do that. She looked at the notebook in her hands. It's not nothing. It's not enough. No, she said, but it's a place to build from, if we survive this morning. Something in his face shifted. That fracture again, the one she'd first seen in the West Wing study, the thing beneath the 11 years of architecture. It was not weakness. She'd had enough time now to understand what it actually was, which was the expression of a man who had held something alone for so long that the possibility of not holding it alone had become, itself, a kind of vertigo. She reached across the carriage and put her hand over his. Not reached, found. The same way he'd found hers outside the burning stable. He looked down at her hand, then up at her. She took her hand back, went back to the notebook. Tell me about Ellsworth. What does he care about? Ellsworth's house was dark when Thomas knocked, and then lit in stages from the inside as a man of 71 was woken, informed there was a ducal carriage at his door, and made the reasonable calculation that this was not the kind of thing one went back to sleep on. He came to his doorstep in a dressing gown and the expression of someone assembling dignity from available materials, and he looked at Lucien, and then at Vivien, and then at the carriage, and then at the sky going pale at the horizon's edge. 6 o'clock, he said. Not a question. 5:50, Lucien said. If we go now. Ellsworth looked at Vivien again. You're the wife. I am, she said. You look like you've been up all night. There was a fire, she said. We managed it. He looked at her for a moment with the assessing gaze of an old man who has been in enough rooms to know what composed under pressure looks like and is deciding whether this is the genuine article. Then he said, Give me 5 minutes, and went back inside, and was back in 4, dressed, coat on, hat in hand, moving with the decisive speed of a man who has been waiting 8 years for a side to have enough to stand on. The oversight board met in a building off Chancery Lane that was old and serious and smelled of old paper and the accumulated weight of decisions made in it over time. There were 7 board members. 4 of them, when Vivien catalogued the room, had Harwick's quality about them. Not his manner, but his certainty. The certainty of people who know the outcome of a meeting before it begins. 2 were Ellsworth's type. Old, careful, waiting. One was a young man she didn't know who sat slightly apart from both groups and watched the room with the attention of someone who has not yet decided. Harwick was already there. Seated at the table's far end, hands folded, wearing an expression of sober concern that had the same quality as his face in the West Wing doorway. The reasonable mask, the practiced instrument of a man who has made a career of appearing to be the reasonable one in every room. He looked at Lucien when they entered, not at Vivien. He had decided, she understood, that she was not the threat. She was the prop. That was the last miscalculation he would make in this room. Crawford came in behind them. His face was gray and his coat was different from last night. He'd had time to go home, change, prepare, but his eyes had the specific look of a man who had been revising his position since 2 in the morning and had arrived at a conclusion he wasn't comfortable with and was going to act on anyway because the alternative was worse. Caldwell, the judge, opened the session. He was a thin, precise man with the careful manner of someone who has spent years performing impartiality and has almost convinced himself it's real. He read the petition. He summarized the grounds. He used the word incapacity 3 times in 4 sentences, and each time he used it, he did not look at Lucian, which was itself a species of testimony. Harwick was given the floor. He spoke well. She acknowledged it, the same way you acknowledge a machine is well made even when it's being used against you. He laid out the medical attestations, Greer's documentation, the pattern of estate management conducted entirely through intermediaries, the evidence of a household operating without direct ducal oversight. He was reasonable. He was concerned. He was, in the performance of it, a man who deeply regretted the situation and simply felt it was his duty to the trust's beneficiaries to raise these questions. When he finished, Caldwell moved to call the vote. Ellsworth said, "I have a question." Caldwell paused. Something in Harwick's face recalculated, slight, controlled. "Lord Ellsworth," Caldwell said, "the petition references Dr. Greer's attestation as the medical basis for the incapacity claim." Ellsworth's voice was old but not weak, the voice of a man who had chosen his moment and was using it with the precision of 8 years of patience. "I'd like to know when Lord Harwick first became aware of this attestation." Harwick said smoothly, "The attestation was brought to my attention by concerned parties earlier this year." "Concerned parties," Ellsworth said, "not the physician himself." "That is correct." "So Lord Harwick has had access to a private medical document concerning the Duke of Blackthorne for some portion of this year, and has chosen to introduce it at a board session called on less than 6 hours' notice following a fire at the Duke's estate." Ellsworth looked at Caldwell. "I find the timing irregular." Caldwell said, "The emergency session was called on the basis of the fire," Ellsworth said. "Yes, a fire at the Duke's estate that occurred the same night Lord Harwick paid an unannounced visit to that estate." He paused. "I would also find that irregular." The room had changed temperature. The 4 Harwick men at the table were the particular stillness of people recalibrating. The young man, apart from both groups, was leaning forward slightly. Vivien stood up. She had not been given the floor. She took it. "My name is Vivian Blackthorne," she said. "Duchess of Blackthorne. I have been legally the Duke's wife for 2 days. I arrived at Blackthorne Manor yesterday afternoon." She looked at Harwick. "I was in the west wing of the manor at 2 in the morning when the fire began. I was with my husband." She turned to Caldwell. "I would like to enter a witness account." Caldwell looked at Harwick. A small look, quickly covered, but Vivien had been watching for it, and it was there, but the instinctive consultation, the flicker of a man checking with the person who owned him. She said, "I would also like to note for the record that Judge Caldwell appears to be seeking guidance from Lord Harwick before ruling on a procedural matter. I find that irregular as well." The room went very quiet. Harwick looked at her for the first time, directly, with the full assessing weight of a man who is revising an estimation he'd already made. She held his gaze and did not look away. She presented the witness account. She presented what she had observed, the directness of Lucien's movement through the unlighted wing, the precision of his gaze, the wine glass, the documents he'd located and retrieved without assistance, and the specific, unambiguous moment when a man had come through his door and Lucian had turned and found him across a dark room with the accuracy of someone who could see exactly where he was. She presented it in the flat, precise language of someone describing a ledger. Here are the entries, here are the dates, here's what the numbers say. Then she opened the notebook. She presented Crawford's testimony. He gave it himself, in the room, standing, his voice unsteady but his account exact. The account of 11 years of observation during which Lucien had performed blindness with sufficient conviction to deceive everyone in his household, which was itself evidence that the performance had been exactly that. She presented the instruction sheet from the man she had struck with the correspondence box, which bore Harwick's name in the address line, and the 3 words she did not read aloud in the room, but passed to Ellsworth, who read them and went very still. She presented Whitmore's letter. Not the physician himself. He was in Bath and he was dying, and they had not reached him, and she had known since 3 in the morning that they would not have him today. She had planned around the absence. Whitmore's letter was an old man's conscience put on paper, addressed to Lucien with a copy she now understood had also been sent directly to the board's administrative secretary, which was why Alderton had written to Lucien in the first place. Because Whitmore, dying and thorough, had sent his account to everyone who might receive it in time. She presented the question of Caldwell's appointment. She did not present evidence of the transaction. She did not have it. She presented the question itself, in writing, formally, as a matter requiring investigation by an independent auditor before any vote on the petition could be considered valid. She presented it in language she had worked out in the carriage, in the margins of the notebook's last page, in the handwriting of someone who has learned that how you frame a question determines whether it can be ignored. It could not be ignored. Harwick tried. She gave him credit for trying. He was composed, precise, attacked Crawford's reliability, attacked the admissibility of the instruction sheet, attacked her standing as a witness with less than 2 days of legal connection to the household. He attacked it all with the smooth, reasonable efficiency of a man who had never in 11 years encountered a set of objections he couldn't manage. The young man, apart from both groups, said, "I'd like to second the motion for independent audit of Judge Caldwell's appointment." Harwick looked at him. Something in Harwick's face for the first time went uncertain. Ellsworth seconded it. The vote on the petition was suspended pending investigation. Caldwell left the room without meeting anyone's eyes. Harwick stood at the end of the table and looked at Lucien, and what was in his face then was not the reasonable mask and was not the cold calculation of the carriage ride. It was the face of a man who has spent 11 years on a construction and is watching it come apart from a direction he didn't see coming, from a variable he had weighed and dismissed as irrelevant, and is understanding now the full cost of that dismissal. He looked at Vivien. She looked back. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. The notebook was in her hands, and his name was in it 47 times, and the room had just voted to look in the direction she had pointed. He left. They did not speak until they were back in the carriage. Thomas drove them north, away from Chancery Lane and away from the building where 11 years had begun. This morning. Their slow unwinding. The city went past the windows in the early morning light, the particular quality of London at 7 in the morning before it is fully committed to being awake. And Vivien sat with the notebook in her lap and felt the specific exhaustion of a body that has been operating past its reasonable limit and has only now received permission to notice. Lucien sat across from her. He was looking at his hands. "Whitmore's letter," he said. "You knew he'd sent it to the secretary." "I thought it was possible. A man who sends copies sends them to everyone who needs to receive them. The administrative secretary is who you send to if you want something in the formal record." She paused. "I didn't know. I arranged around the possibility." "You presented it as though you knew." "In a room where Harwick was certain," she said, "uncertainty was the thing I couldn't afford to show." He looked up. "That's not accounting. That's something else." "It's the same thing," she said. "Numbers or words, the principle is the same. You find the one true piece and you build outward from it until the structure holds. Whitmore's letter was true. The observation account was true. Crawford's testimony was true. The instruction sheet was true." She held his gaze. "Everything I put in front of that room was real. I only arranged it to be seen." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, London was thinning, the buildings giving way to the longer distances she'd watched from this same carriage 2 days ago, moving in the other direction, toward something she hadn't understood yet. "My father used to say," Lucien said slowly, "that a title is the smallest part of what a house stands for, that Blackthorne was the people in it and the decisions made from it over time, and that a duke is only as real as what he does with what he's been given." He looked at the window. "I spent 11 years thinking about what had been taken. I didn't spend enough time thinking about what remained." She waited. "You remained," he said. "Not you specifically. I hadn't found you yet. But the possibility of what you represent, that there were people in the world who couldn't be bought because they'd already been through the thing that buying is supposed to threaten, and had come out the other side without needing to be protected from it." He paused. "I looked for that. I looked for it practically and strategically and for entirely self-interested reasons. I found it in you." He met her eyes. "And then I watched you hit a man with a box and present a 4-hour notebook of evidence to a board of 7 men at 6 in the morning after no sleep. And I understood that whatever I had planned for and whatever you actually are not the same thing, and that the difference is entirely in your favor." She was quiet for a moment. "My father gambled," she said, because he believed the next hand would be the one that changed everything. He was always one win away from the version of his life where the disaster hadn't happened. She looked at the window. I spent a long time being angry at him for that. Then I spent some time understanding it. There's a version of what you did that's the same thing. One more year of the performance, one more piece in place, one more careful move toward the version of your life where they hadn't taken everything. She paused. I understand it. I understand it because I have my own version of it. The thing I kept one more year in the bottom drawer because as long as I didn't take it out and look at it, I didn't have to know it was over. He waited. My mother's pressed flowers, she said. I left them. The carriage was quiet. The road north opened ahead of them. We'll go back for them, he said. She looked at him. Aldermere Street, he said. When this is finished, we'll go back for whatever you left. She held his gaze and felt the specific gravity of a man saying a thing he means, not performing meaning, not arranging it for effect, just meaning it, the blunt, uncomplicated weight of a true sentence in a room that has had too many constructed ones. All right, she said. Outside, the road was going north through country that had no opinion about any of it. The same indifferent England that had held the moors in place while a manor burned and an old man wrote letters and a carriage moved in the dark toward a room where the small, careful dismantling of 11 years of theft had begun. The country held all of it the same way it held the weather, without preference, without arrangement. They let it pass. Vivien opened the notebook one more time and read through what she'd written, the full accounting of the night, names, dates, connections, the architecture of what Harwick had built, and the points she had found where it was load-bearing and the points where it was not. She was already thinking about the independent auditor, about what they would find in Caldwell's finances if they looked at the right years, about the investigation report from the bridge and the name she'd written on the last page that Lucien hadn't noticed her write, the wife's brother who had conducted it, who was 60 years old and had a house in Wiltshire, and presumably did not want to be investigated for conspiracy in the deaths of a duke and duchess 12 years past. There was still work. There would be work for months. The trust petition was suspended, not defeated. Harwick was contained, not finished. Crawford would testify fully only if he believed the risk of not testifying outweighed the risk of Harwick's retaliation, and that calculation had to be managed. She knew how to manage it. She had the notebook. She closed it. Lucien was watching her. The carriage rocked north and the light was full morning now, coming in at a low angle through the east-facing windows, and in the morning light without the drama of fire or smoke or a room full of men, he was simply what he was, tired, unperformed, sitting across from her in a carriage heading home, wearing the face of a man who had come through something and knows what it cost and is still here. She thought about what it meant to rebuild a thing from what the wreckage left. She had done it in small forms her entire life. The household budget after her father's losses, the accounts reconstructed after the bookkeeper quit, the version of herself assembled from what her mother's illness and her father's failure had not managed to use up. You worked with what remained. You did not wait for the version of things where the damage hadn't happened, because that version was not available. You started from the rubble, and you built something that was not the original thing, and was not pretending to be. That was what this was, what it would continue to be. She looked at Lucien across the carriage. When we get back, she said, I want to meet with Mrs. Denton. I want to understand the full household, who's been here how long, what the actual structure of management is, what's been performed and what's been real. Yes. And I want to see the full trust documents, not the summary. The originals. They're in the traveling box. I know. I want to read them properly, tonight. He looked at her for a moment. Is there anything, he said, that you don't approach as a set of numbers to be reconciled? She thought about it honestly. My mother's flowers, she said. I couldn't do the accounting on those. He was quiet. Then, no. Some things don't reconcile. They just remain. Yes, she said. They remain. The carriage went north. The road widened past the city's last edge and opened into the long country, and somewhere ahead of them the oak tunnel at Blackthorne's approach road was catching the morning light the way old trees catch it, completely, without reservation. the way things catch light when they have been standing long enough to know it always comes back. Vivian Hale had been sold for £11,000 on a rainy night in a mortgaged house on Aldermere Street, and she was returning to a manor with a burned stable and a west wing that smelled of smoke and a document room that would need to be reorganized from the top shelf down. She was returning to a household learning to calibrate for a duchess, to a husband who had planned for her and then failed to plan for what she actually was, and who was sitting across from her in a carriage at 7 in the morning with the notebook she'd filled still in her hands and the fire iron still propped absurdly against the wall because neither of them had thought to put it somewhere else. She reached over and took the fire iron and laid it on the seat beside her. "We should probably return that to the study," she said. "Probably," he said. Neither of them moved it again. The carriage went on. The morning held. Ahead of them, through country that was neither kind nor cruel but simply old and continuous and vast, Blackthorne Manor sat on its rise above the moors waiting for them to come back to it, as it had waited through 2 centuries of people who had lived and failed and built and lost inside its walls, and as it would wait long after all the particulars of this specific morning had faded into the general record of the house's long patience. The stones of it had seen enough to know that what mattered was not the disaster, but what was made from the ground it left behind. What was made, in the end, was this: 2 people in a carriage, going home. A notebook in a woman's hands. A man watching her with eyes that saw everything, had always seen everything, and were no longer pretending otherwise. It was not what either of them had planned for. It was, in the accounting of it, enough